So basically, in this seminar, I'm going to go over four things. We'll go through rebuttal basics, we'll go through thematic rebuttal, we'll go through integrated rebuttal, and then throughout, I'll be talking about different points of strategy that can help with all of those things. Cool. So let's start with rebuttal basics. This is probably most useful if you have sort of limited debating experience, but I guess if you would like to review this, that's good for you as well. So first of all, I think it's useful to talk about what the purpose of rebuttal is, what you actually want your rebuttal to do. And I think there's broadly four general purposes of rebuttal that we want to do. The first one is mitigation, which is basically when we play down the significance of their point. This sounds like saying things like, well, the opposition doesn't affect as many students as they claim to. So what we're trying to do here is to say that the opposition's benefits are smaller than they claimed, but they're still true. On the flip side, we could say that the harms they accuse us of incurring are not as big as they suggest, but still possible. So mitigation can be really useful because it means their points are less important. They're less of a big consideration in the debate, but you should never just mitigate in rebuttal, for the reason that when you are mitigating, you're not necessarily proving that their benefits don't exist or that the harms they say occur on your side do not occur. You're simply saying they are smaller than was implied. So what you want to do is combine mitigation with other forms of rebuttal. So secondly, the second form of rebuttal is just disproving them. So this is where we explain why the opposition's points are untrue or why they don't make sense. So that's saying things like, well, the opposition won't benefit students at all, or they might actively harm them in particular ways. So the claim here is that they have no benefits, just harms, that their side is actively bad. And so that's obviously a bit stronger than mitigation, because here we're making an active claim about whether the opposition gets their benefits or is able to accuse you of harms. We're not just playing them down or making them smaller. Thirdly, we can use rebuttal to weigh up different ideas. So because there are many different ideas and clashes in debates, it's very helpful to be able to weigh those up and decide which ones are more or less important than others. And I'll be going into some strategies about how to do that soon. But basically, it sounds like saying things like, oh, well, they did have some benefits, but they were much less important than the harms that we told you about. And so they will still lose despite those benefits. And then fourthly, you can use your rebuttal to undermine the premises of the other side. So even if their claims are true, you can kind of flip them over and explain why they are actually bad. So you might say, well, their characterization of students was true, but it didn't work in the way they thought it did. It actually proved this point for our side. So we're changing the characterization of, or we're admitting their characterization is true, but we're saying that actually works for our side. So we can either play their points down, we can disprove them altogether, we can weigh them up with different ideas to prove that they're relatively unimportant, or we can kind of flip particular premises of their points over onto our side. All right, let's go through some types of rebuttal, which kind of are similar to the purposes of rebuttal and help us go about that. So I think there are broadly three types of rebuttal. The first one is rebuttal about logic, where the opposition has said something that just doesn't make sense. That could be because they have a tension in their case. So maybe there are two things that they have said which don't really gel that well together. If one is true, it might make the other one more likely or less important. So we can point that out in the context of rebuttal about logic. But also, if they haven't explained something properly, if they've just asserted a claim without providing reasons why it might be true, we can point it out here too. We can say, they never really explained this. I would note, you shouldn't just do rebuttal about logic without explaining why it's important. So we don't just want to say, well, they have a bit of a contradiction in their case, or they haven't really explained this. We want to turn that into a kind of more powerful claim about their case and say, they had a tension, and here is why, however you solve that tension, it's bad for their case. Or they haven't explained something properly, and here's how we would explain it, which, presumably is not what they would want to say. So you can really use rebuttal about logic to reframe their kind of nonsensical claims in a way that favors your side. Secondly, there's rebuttal about facts. So this is when we're arguing that whatever they have said is not true or realistic. So this can be used to explain why their characterization or their mechanisms or their stakeholders don't actually play out how they've explained them to be. So you're challenging their sort of conception of the world and the way it works. And it's also when you're flipping the implications of their claims. So you're saying, well, that fact is true, but the implications of it are not. I think an important note for this one is, when you're arguing about facts in debating, you don't just rebut facts that are objectively untrue. So obviously, if the opposition just lies, you can rebut that. You probably should rebut that. But you can also challenge potentially true but speculative claims about the world. So if they suggest that stakeholders will act in X way, you can, like, that could be perfectly reasonable, but you can still provide reasons why it is unlikely that they do. So we're kind of using inductive reasoning here, where we're saying, what is the most likely way that the world would work? And the more reasons you provide for your characterization of the world, the more likely you are to win that kind of characterization battle. So basically here, in rebuttal about facts, we can either challenge clearly and obviously wrong claims about the world, but we can also challenge the ones that might be true by explaining reasons why it is probably not true. Finally, we have rebuttal about significance. This is basically where we weigh up different points and lower the importance of theirs. So we're saying that their points are less significant than ours. And that can be really powerful, particularly at third speaker, in terms of working out which ideas you may have won in the debate and trying to emphasize those and get the adjudicator to really appreciate those above the claims of the other team's case. Okay, so I think it might be useful quickly to explain how to discuss significance, since this is a important and maybe one of the trickier parts of rebuttal. So there's obviously like a multiplicity of ways you can discuss significance, but I find these 5 pretty helpful. And I would note they can kind of come up against each other. You can weigh up the different types of significance as well. So first of all, the scale. This is really intuitive. It's just which side affects more people. Obviously, you can make the argument that the side that affects more people is the more important side. Secondly, there's the strength of impacts. Again, pretty intuitive. Who affects people more profoundly? Who changes their lives more? And sometimes these two things will have a trade-off, where one side affects a lot of people minimally, and the other side affects a couple of people significantly. So we want to kind of unpack those, explain, or try and quantify the scale and the strength of impacts. Thirdly, we have principles. So this is where we kind of unpack the principled implications of points or stakeholders. So for instance, we often care about vulnerable stakeholders more, and explain why that principled claim, for instance, that we should care about vulnerable stakeholders more, outweighs the other team's point. So an example of that could be, we're in a debate where one side gets benefits for children, the other side gets benefits for adults. We could make the claim that we should prioritize children because they're more vulnerable, they have less choice about the world, and adults are able to sort of self-determine in a way that children can't. So that's a kind of principled claim that helps us discuss significance. There's also risk versus reward. So you can use this in 2 ways, the risk way and the reward way, but basically this is about weighing up the likeliness of an effect happening versus its magnitude. So for instance, an effect which is very unlikely probably is less important, but if it is a very large risk or a very big reward, then maybe we would care about it more, even though it's unlikely. So for instance, we might say, well, if my actions could cause the apocalypse, I would probably err on the side of caution, even if it was unlikely that that would occur, because that's just such a large magnitude harm. So you could claim, well, the other team's points were much less likely than ours, so they're less important. But you could also try to claim that the other team's points were lower in magnitude, even if they were more likely. Finally, and I think this is a useful tool, particularly when you're doing weighing at the end of a speech and you're trying to sort of picture both worlds and weigh them up, is talking about mutual exclusivity. So one thing to be thinking about at the bench when you're trying to rebut things is, does the effect that the opposition is talking about exist on both sides of the debate? So if they accuse you of a harm, then is that harm also something that happens on their side of the debate? If they claim they get a benefit, then can you get that benefit in other ways as well? And if you can clearly explain why that effect exists on the other side of the debate, that issue sort of becomes a wash. It's less important because both sides get roughly the same outcomes. And you can use that to then explain why you alone get other benefits or they alone incur particular harms. So you can say this particular point becomes roughly equal, but here is what distinguishes our team and means we will win. And all of these things are particularly useful at the end of your speech or at the end of an issue of rebuttal, just to provide an overall perspective of why it matters and how it will affect the debate. Related to this is how to be comparative, which is really important for adequately engaging in the other case. I'm going to give you an example of why it's important. So if you aren't comparative and you're in a debate about sanctioning a dictator or something like that, it's very common that you'll hear the claim that you will make the dictatorship worse. You'll enrage the dictator, or you'll provide them funding in some way, or you'll provide them more influence on the world stage. But it's obviously pretty simple to dismiss that reasoning if they haven't been comparative by saying, well, that dictator is bad anyway. We don't think we make that dictatorship that much worse, but we do get some other huge benefit. So that's why being comparative is important, because it allows you to distinguish specifically what makes your side unique. And it allows you to avoid easy rebuttals that are just like, well, that happens on your side as well. So when you're being comparative, you can do this in rebuttal. You can also build it into your points. You should be asking yourselves things like, why do they incur this harm only, or why do they get it much worse? Why do we get this benefit only, or why we get it much better? And overall, what do both worlds look at best case? So throughout your rebuttal, you should generally be trying to take the opposition at their best. That means interpreting them charitably, not straw manning them, and trying to work out sort of, if everything they claimed worked out, why would it still not be ideal? And I'll show you how to do that in a little bit more detail later. But I think the takeaways from this section are, you should be engaging in a number of different types of rebuttal. You should always be going for the kind of fairest and most persuasive claim, which is engaging with their best case. And you should be trying to weigh those up with your case as well. All right, let's move on to thematic rebuttal. So briefly, what is thematic and why should you do it? Thematic rebuttal is pretty simple. It's really just about organizing our rebuttal into big themes and issues and questions. We can complicate it more from there, but at base, it is just about trying to sort our ideas into the main questions of the debate. And there are three good things that you get out of doing it. The first one is, it will make your speech neater. It will stop you from repeating yourself and getting sidetracked. So if, for instance, you have never used thematic, you might notice that sometimes you accidentally repeat yourself, or you'll go off on a weird tangent and you'll come back to what you were initially talking about. And that's because you have a whole, a heap of rebuttal, and you can't really get through it without accidentally getting it messed up and going in directions that you didn't mean to. If you can do thematic, you will not really experience that harm, because it will already be sorted into themes that are roughly the same main idea. The second thing is, it allows you to be more efficient, because you're arguing against clashes or questions or themes as a whole. You're not dealing with individual unit rebuttal or just like sentences of the other team. So it will make your speech easier to get through. And then finally, it allows you to make commentary on the different issues in the debate more easily, because you get more of a macro view of the debate. So I'll go through how to do each of these things later. But first, let's talk about a really common question, which is, what should your themes actually be? People often have a lot of difficulty working out how to decide your themes. So I think a really simple balance is, they should not be too large or too small. What I mean by that is, you need more than one theme. So if you just have one big theme, chances are it's the debate question. For instance, if we have the debate that we should ban homework, and your big theme is homework good or bad? That is probably just the debate, and it doesn't really do its job, because it doesn't help you break down your speech or structure it any more than you otherwise would have. So you should definitely have more than one theme. 2 to 3 is generally a good guide. Similarly, though, your theme should not be too small in scope. So you don't want to have like 7 themes and then some rebuttal left out of them. If you're doing that, it's probably too specific. You won't be able to get through it in time, and it doesn't do the job of making a nice macro view of the debate, like having 2 to 3 well-argued themes would. So try to, when you're trying to think of themes, what you should generally be aiming to do is think of, like, if I could think of 3 questions that, if answered, would help decide the debate, what are they? And that will help you keep your themes nice and relevant, and really pushing your side of the debate. So themes are usually debate specific. You should definitely tailor them to the debate, but there are some common breakdowns which can make your life easier, at least when you're trying to work out what the themes could be. Maybe consider these ones. So you can often divide debates into stakeholders. For instance, the example I have here is high achieving students, average students, and low achieving students. So if you think there are different effects depending on who you are in the debate, that's often a good route to take. You can also do it based on types of consequences. So how would this affect academic needs of students, social needs, and emotional needs? So this is where we're maybe not dividing up students into different types of students. We're dealing with them as a block, but we've observed that there are several main types of things that happen to them. So that can help you deal with that kind of debate. A really common one is long versus short term. For instance, you'll see that in like debates about invasion a lot, where the short term question will be, does the invasion actually work? And then the long term one will be like, does it leave a horrible power vacuum in that country in the long term? And then finally, principle versus practical. So where you have an argument more about morals and ethics, you can distinguish that from the practical section of the debate, which is about the kind of real world outcomes. And obviously you can combine these. So you could have a principle and then two stakeholders, or a long-term question and then a short, like a principle and a short term, or something like that. But those, I guess, are a good start for trying to decide what principle or what themes you will use. But we do need to adapt it to the debate. So here are some examples of how we could do that. First of all, let's say we had the topic that we should have quotas for women in parliament. My instinct, perhaps going into the debate, could be, how will this affect female politicians and how will this affect policy? Maybe that's the main thing that I'm sort of thinking of in prep. But then maybe the other team stands up and talks about a principle. It could be meritocracy on negative. It could be reparations for sexism on affirmative. If that's the case, it's pretty easy to deal with. We would probably just add another theme. Is this principally just? So if there turns out to be something extra in the debate, you can work around it often by simply adding a theme. That's like pretty easy to adapt to, as you can see. Here's another example where we change the themes a little bit more. So let's say we're doing that we should ban selective schools. My instinct here would be, at first, how does this affect students' academic results? So does it mean people achieve less, or does it help kids at comprehensive schools to achieve more? And then how does it affect students' social well-being? So how do kids feel when they're put into a different school? But let's say then the affirmative talks a lot about children in comprehensive schools and the idea of social equality, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. So I have to change my themes quite a lot. I will probably make them into something like, how does this affect selective school students? How does this affect non-selective school students? And how does this affect social equality as a whole? So obviously that changed quite a bit from my initial instincts, but the good thing is you will probably be able to tell that pretty early on, because it will come out in the affirmative. In this case, the affirmative's probably first speaker, what their points will be. And so you can adapt to it pretty easily. In this case, I've realized that we're going to be distinguishing between different types of stakeholders, selective school students and comprehensive school students. And I've adapted to that rather than the different types of impacts that I initially had. Cool. Okay, so with that said on how to select your themes, let's talk about what to actually use them for. So I think this differs quite a lot depending on if you've never used themes before, in which case you should start relatively small, or if you're more experienced. So let's first deal with what happens if you're first starting off, you're finding thematic rebuttal, frankly, really confusing and intimidating, and you don't want to mess it up. Basically, I think, first of all, you should just try to divide your ideas into a couple of key themes, like we've talked about in the previous slides, and then just put your regular rebuttal underneath each heading. So you're not doing all the commentary stuff that I'm going to talk about in a second. You're simply sorting your rebuttal basically into piles. And that will get you used to using that kind of structure and identifying what the themes are. Once you're practiced at that, it gets a lot easier. Then just have a brief look over your notes before you're standing up to check your themes are all good. That will calm you down. And I recommend using paper and a table. I know sometimes in high school people like using palm cards and just holding things, but the good thing about using a table is you spread it all out and you can see what you're doing. You can see the kind of macro issues of the debate. It helps you to follow a lot more easily. And then I would also say, if you're speaking at first or second speaker, it can be good just to use their main points as themes. So for instance, I'll start by dealing with their principle, then I'll move on to their arguments about students and teachers. So that still gets you used to the structure. It makes your speech neater. It's maybe not perfect thematic, but it's definitely a good start. And I think it helps you to kind of get used to at least sorting your ideas. So those are certain tips for just how to begin with thematic. What do we do if we've kind of already learned that? There are 4 main things that you should consider when you're trying to use your themes. The first one is you should be trying to have some internal structure within themes. You don't just want it to be a list of rebuttal or a list of claims. We should be trying to identify the main claims or bits of contention within the themes and focusing on those. That will help us get through them. Otherwise, it will be like really difficult to get through our speech. We should also be providing some commentary about why things are comparatively strong or weak and doing our impacting and weighing up. So, for instance, at the start of our question, we might say, note if we can win this particular question, then it will be very good for us. It will, maybe make us win the debate for X, Y, and Z reasons. So that commentary is a really good part of being able to use themes, because now that your ideas are more sort of compact or they're more efficient and they're responding to ideas as a whole rather than individual claims or sentences, you can start to make that commentary kind of like an adjudicator does. Thirdly, you should be referencing previous responses and whipping material. So this is particularly the case at third. So basically, particularly, for instance, at third neg, the adjudicator doesn't want to listen to any new material coming from you. Oh, hang on, I'll just go back. They don't want to listen to any new material from you. And so, come on. And so basically, you want to make sure that your claims are tied into the rest of the debate. You want to be referencing back. That makes you sound a lot more compelling. It makes it sound like your team has been working together as a whole, which is a good thing. So basically, you want to do things like saying, we already told you at first speaker X response, and they never responded to it, which was problematic because it meant they never successfully proved X. Or you could say, the point we gave you at second negative clearly engaged with this idea. And so basically doing that referencing and explaining why the material your team has said earlier in the debate is really powerful in terms of making the adjudicator realize that your team has had all these good ideas from first and second speaker as well as third. Finally, I think a really important aspect of this is prioritization. So sometimes it can be really easy to kind of accidentally focus on something that didn't really matter that much in the debate and wasting a lot of your time. And so it's really valuable to be able to organize your themes and the material within them in kind of preferential order of how valuable they are and how important they are. That will make you a lot more efficient. Basically, the way I think you should deal with prioritization is just to think about what you need to prove to win the debate. You can consider that your burden of proof. So that basically requires some strategizing at the bench. You want to be thinking, what do I need to prove to win this debate? What hasn't my team proven sufficiently yet? What are the opposition's weaknesses? And that should guide your prioritization. It should help you work out the things to respond to first. Okay, so I'm going to show you a typed up and slightly neater version of some notes from a debate I did on the weekend. The topic was that the European Union should expel Hungary for Hungary's emergency laws during COVID. We were on the negative and I was third speaker. So my themes were, does the EU have a principled obligation to kick out Hungary? Because the affirmative wanted to say that the EU as a democratic institution should kick you out if you weren't acting in democratic ways. Secondly, how will it affect the EU as an institution? So my team had a bunch of claims about why this would undermine the EU and make certain countries view it more suspiciously. And then finally, how it will affect the behavior of Hungary. So I want you to just imagine the first two themes, because we're going to skip to the third theme and look at my notes about how I would deal with that. Cool. So here are my notes. I obviously do this in a particular way. If you want to use a different way, that's fine. You would notice I have some color coding. That's because I like it. Oops. Okay, let's keep it A4 shape. That's because I like color coding. I think it highlights things in a way that works for me. You don't have to do that, but feel free to steal it as well. So start off with the name of the theme. Will this change Hungary? Or will it change their behavior? Then I would have some commentary to explain why this theme matters. So I'd say something like, note that this is important because the opposition has spent a lot of time in this debate talking about the principle of democracy, which means if we can prove Hungary does not become more democratic, we will win. Then I will just do some signposting to set up what this theme sort of looked like. So in this case, I'll go through what my team said instead. So down the bench, we argued that instead of expelling Hungary, the EU should take advantage of a scalable internal process, which could include things like political processes, condemning them in the parliament or whatever, financial penalties, sanctions, and getting EU financial monitors in to see how Hungary spends EU money. And we said it was preferable to expelling Hungary because it meant you had ongoing bargaining chips. You didn't give away all your power at once. You had access to information via the monitoring. And we thought that just kicking them out altogether would inflame nationalism more because it would basically, it's very unprecedented and it would look very bad in Hungary. And we thought that Orban would probably use it to whip up nationalism and anti-globalism for his own purposes. So then I'll introduce what we heard from affirmative. I'll say, so what did we hear in response to this from affirmative? So let's say they had 3 claims. In this case, they did. The first one was, we should be able to provide big penalties like sanctions. And we said, well, this is a misconception. It's not true. The EU is able to place sanctions on countries within it. For instance, Austria, which they did, I think, a couple of years ago. Secondly, obviously, this is not mutually exclusive. Both sides can provide sanctions then, but ours are more useful because we also get the benefits of scalability and so on. And then finally, if it is the case that big penalties are so good, then we should keep them as a bargaining chip for later when we might need them more. So this one's that kind of flipping a fact. So we're saying, even if it is the case that the claim from the other team is true, why is it important that we don't do what they say? Then the second claim was economic consequences for Hungary will change minds because once you're kicked out of the EU, you become very poor, you realize this was all a bad idea, and you'll change towards liberalism to get back in. So our responses are, first of all, this is untrue. It is unproven in this debate that you will necessarily have bad economic consequences. We think you can receive support from other actors who might be anti-EU or who might be led by strongman leaders. For instance, like Russia or America might do it, and therefore we don't know you'll become poor. But we think even if that did happen, it would actually confirm nationalism, anti-globalism, and Euroscepticism, which would mean in the long run, they would not want to change and rejoin because of that kind of consolidation of power from Orban. And then finally, even if this was true, we could also impose sanctions, which would get a similar effect, but it would not be an unprecedented action that would have the same reaction. And then finally, their claim is, well, nationalism will be bad on either side, so we may as well just go ahead with the biggest punishment possible. So then we might respond to that by saying, well, obviously nationalism is worse if you're doing an unprecedented decision, which you literally have to create a new legal process for, which might be perceived as biased because big countries have dominated the decision-making process. So the other team are not being comparative. In fact, our side is better. But also, we think overall there'll be less division in other countries in the EU if smaller measures, which are within the existing framework, the existing legal framework of the EU, are implemented. That would be less inflammatory. Cool. So that's the bulk of our claims. And then at the end, we want to kind of summarize, we want to show what we've proved. So we might say something like, we have shown to you that Hungary will only consolidate in the opposition's plan because they do such an unprecedented action that we think many countries around the world would disagree with quite a lot. But also, we think they're giving a big bargaining chip away, in fact, probably the biggest one by their own analysis, and therefore they lose power in the long run. And so then we might add some commentary about what this conclusion for us actually means. So we might say, which means at our very worst case, well, maybe we will still inflame nationalism in Hungary through things like financial penalties. And that means at that point is a wash. But it is only on our side that we get things like the scalability, that we get the ability to monitor Hungary and to keep them within the EU political process. And so we think that we will always take this point because maybe the harms were all the same, but we got some specific benefits that the opposition could not claim. So that's that kind of working out what is mutually exclusive at the end. Okay. Some people do their notes like this, where there's 2 columns. So you can try that as well, but it's not my favorite. Cool. So I hope that kind of helps show you what a potential structure within your themes could look like. Obviously, not every debate is the same as that one, but maybe it can provide some inspiration or something you can steal. Okay, so I think the main takeaways from all of this is, why is thematic good? it provides you with organization in your speech, it makes you more efficient, and it allows you to provide commentary about what is important and what matters in the debate. The way we do it is basically just to sort our rebuttal into big ideas, but we can kind of build on that by trying to use it to push our most important points in the debate, and also to kind of pursue the things that we think will win us the debate. In terms of how you think of themes, you should remember common themes, but adapt them to the debate specifically. That will make them a lot easier to use. And also, I would say that practice is probably the best way to get good at thematic. Okay, moving on to integrated rebuttal. So what is integrated rebuttal? Basically, you know when your material and your rebuttal overlap, and you kind of get to a piece in your rebuttal and you're like, oh wait, I'm going to respond to this in my point, sorry. And it's just a bit messy and it's kind of annoying. Sometimes you end up saying it twice. Basically, integrated rebuttal is a way to get around that. It helps make your first and your second speeches more efficient because you don't have to spend so much time unnecessarily distinguishing between rebuttal and substantive. So basically, all you do is you incorporate your rebuttal into your points, or vice versa, and signpost which bits are rebuttal, which bits are responding to something that the other team said. Sometimes you'll have sort of one issue of pure rebuttal, and then another of rebuttal and substantive, and another of just substantive, or something like that. Whatever works. Basically, it's simply to adapt to having an overlap between your rebuttal and your material. Cool. I think it's a useful caveat just to say this isn't always useful. It's not obligatory to do. I certainly don't use it in every speech, and that's fine. Basically, you should just use it where you think it will help. You don't need to do this unnecessarily. It won't win you points with the adjudicators. So how do you integrate your rebuttal? Basically, all you need to do is identify what you actually need to integrate. So for instance, is there a big theme which you don't cover in your speech? Then so have they suggested a big argument which isn't in your speech? Well, don't integrate. Did the opposition just say something your material directly responds to? Probably do integrate. Will your material add to an existing theme as a new response? Yes, you should still integrate it. Cool. So just work out which things can be integrated. Step 2, then integrate it into your notes. So for instance, if you're trying to put rebuttal into a pre-written point from prep, just write whatever you're responding to near the response. If you're doing the reverse and you're taking a point that you have prepared and putting it in your rebuttal, you should write maybe at the bottom of the page or on a different piece of paper what your point is, what it means as a response, and why it's kind of a good new observation. And then step 3, you're going to do your speech. Remember to signpost at the start of the speech that rebuttal will be integrated. Otherwise, the adjudicator will just be confused about where your rebuttal has gone. And then you should also signpost when you get to the relevant parts of your speech. So you want to be saying things like, note, this argument directly responds to X point that the opposition made. Or note, we think that this particular point fits into the overall critique of the rebuttal, or whatever. You just want to make it really clear that you are being responsive. The reason that you want to do that is because otherwise, maybe the adjudicator will miss that you have been responsive in that way, and they won't properly take it into account. But yeah, that's basically how to integrate. So here's an example. Say that we have 3 arguments for that we should progressively tax and redistribute happiness. This placates people in, so these are our three arguments. This placates people in bad conditions. This makes happiness less meaningful, and this doesn't lead to more happiness in the long run. So that's what we've prepared. Then the affirmative, and we're negative. Okay, so then the affirmative gets up and they say why it improves life for disadvantaged people, why it's principally fair, and why it makes people happier overall. So I would say that this idea about improving life for disadvantaged people would definitely have to do with this placates people in bad conditions. That's a pretty direct response. And then I think why it makes people happier overall can be clearly rebutted through our ideas about how it makes happiness less meaningful and how it doesn't lead to more happiness in the long run. Okay, so that's pretty intuitive, I would say, in matching up those responses. So then I think we would organize it into, is this principally fair? which is the point that the affirmative talked about that we didn't really have an inbuilt response to. So we're just going to deal with that on its own. We're not going to integrate with that. Then we're going to do how does it affect social relations and how does it affect people's happiness. We integrate into the latter two, because obviously within how it affects social relations is about how it affects things like inequality or how it affects disadvantaged people. And then similarly, in terms of how it affects people's happiness, that's where we put all the stuff about what happiness looks like in the long term, whether it actually means anything, and how people might enjoy that happiness. So overall here, basically what we're doing is we're just following the steps I set out earlier. We're working out which points kind of respond to and engage with which, and then we're turning them into an overall theme that we're going to engage with. And then obviously when I presented this, I would point out which bits were responsive and which bits were not. Cool. So are there any questions? Sweeney has sent me two. So the first question is, how much rebuttal should I have if I'm speaking early in the debate? So that depends how early. If you're first affirmative, you don't want any. But basically, I would say you should have enough that you're being relatively thorough and not unresponsive, but you shouldn't be compromising rebuttal. Or, sorry, you shouldn't be doing rebuttal at the expense of presenting your case, and that's really important at first neg. I think being a successful third neg speaker means that you should, first neg speaker means that you need to deliver the neg case. Like that's what a first speaker should do. So you don't want to be rebutting for like 6 minutes and then trying to deliver your case in one. So maybe like 2 minutes or so at first neg. And I think this is where prioritization is really important, because if we work out what are the main claims that the affirmative has made, then that will make it a lot easier to basically work out what to respond to. I say 2 minutes, but that obviously depends what type of debating. So like I would say 2 minutes for a 7-minute speech, maybe, if you're like doing BP, and then 8 minutes, say like 3, 2.5. Yeah, I don't think there's a number necessarily, but basically do not compromise your material. Run through their main points. Your second speaker can probably pick a lot of that up. If you're at second, you should be doing a fair amount of rebuttal. You should also maybe like integrate a lot of rebuttal into whatever substantive you have, or perhaps minimal substantive into your rebuttal, because often second doesn't actually have that much substantive to say anyway. So that's fine. So basically, yeah, at second, we want to be doing a fair bit of rebuttal, particularly at second affirmative, because that's first response. You want to be like pretty thoroughly dealing with the main claims that the first negative has done. And then at second negative, because you're like the last negative speaker who can say new things, new responses, it's a really, or not new responses, but new things. It's a really good idea to do like thorough rebuttal here, where you get to kind of bring up new dimensions and examples and things like that, which means that third neg can spend a lot of time like framing, which is like a pretty useful thing to do at third neg, in my opinion. Yeah, so basically, how much rebuttal you should have if you're speaking early in the debate. Enough that you can get through your substantive as well, but also enough that you can hit at least their main ideas, and like create some contention early in the debate, I suppose. All right, cool. So the next question is, should non-integrated rebuttal always go first in a speech? Not necessarily. I usually would. But just thinking about that habit, I actually don't think it's necessary, in the sense that maybe it's just kind of a secondary thought, or maybe you want to prove other things first, in which case that's fine. So let's say that you had a principled argument that you were rebutting and it wasn't integrated. And maybe you thought that it was kind of contingent on the practical parts of the debate. You might start with the practical parts of the debate and get to the principle and be like, here is why this principle is contingent. So all of the stuff I mentioned earlier was the way we win this. And I think that's fine. So yeah, I think sometimes or often it might make the most sense, but actually it should just, the logic of where you put non-integrated rebuttal should actually just be the logic of where you put your themes. And also, as long as you get through them, then it's actually not that important, because you've put all the ideas into the world. So yeah, I would say it's kind of fine. Okay, nice. I think that's all then. Thanks for watching.